We're here at Pukerangiora, and just looking around, it's easy to understand, why this was selected as a pā site. Tell us about Pukerangiora. What do you know about this place?
Pukerangiora was a pā that was perhaps the most important pā for Te Ātiawa in this area. It was a place of extremely important defences. We've got the river running just along the back of it, which is almost impossible to attack from that side, and very strong defences along towards the south. The pā of Pukerangiora is a little bit different in that it has a long history of battles in this area, and it fell twice to battles against Waikato during the wars, in the intertribal wars of the 1820s, 1830s. So the fact that Te Ātiawa came back into this area in the time of the war against the Crown is significant. And quite often, ka kiake he paeke, we refer to them as pā that were overcome by enemy. Sometimes we don't return to them, but the significance of this pā meant that they ended up at this point to defend themselves against a further attack from the Crown.
Was it just a military pā, or did people live here? Was it a kāinga?
For most pā, I don't think people tended to live in pā. They lived around them, and they retreated back to them in times of conflict. So there was always the emphasis on maintaining reserves of kai, water in these areas, just in case they were attacked. And we need to understand that we're in the midst of war at this point, so they were already in a position of defence. We're at the tail end of what is deemed to be the first stage of the Taranaki Wars. So they ended up in this place as a place of extreme defence. So I don't think they were living in here as such.
The rangatira here, Hapurona. Tell us about Hapurona. What kind of leader was he?
Hapurona is one of those leaders who perhaps wasn't put forward at a young age as being the leader, but someone who came from the fighting around the coast in Opinake. As far as I know, he was raised in the time of the warfare between Taranaki and Te Wherowhero. He learnt from the great leaders such as Te Matakatea. So he understood perfectly the need to have strategy. Before you go into battle, you don't just occupy a spot and then just hope that it will work out well. You plan extremely well how you're going to locate your forces, how you're going to make available resources so that you are able to fall back in contingencies. He understood that, and so when he came here to this area, as far as I know, this is the area of his mother's side, Pukerangiora, his father's side, Ngāti Haumia from Opinake. He came here perhaps and perhaps even asked to come here by his whanaunga of Pukerangiora because they knew of his background, they knew of his experience. And so when war was threatening in this area, they turned to Hapurona to give guidance. Many within Te Ātiawa had come from times of peace. They were focusing on growing, cultivating food. They were they were focusing on trading. That was their emphasis. And suddenly they realized the Crown was more focused in on escalating the conflict, escalating the tension. And that's probably the point at which Hapurona became the key focus of giving leadership to Te Ātiawa.
And they were trading all up this river. They had relationships with organisations and ships that were trading overseas.
Well, for many people in today's times, they look at Waitara and they think, well, Waitara is this town, it has this background. We failed to recognise the huge significance of this location. The fact that it was on, I like to think of it as like on State Highway number 1, which was the river. This gave access to all of Te Ātiawa, to all of the reserves far inland. We've got very few rivers are of any great width or volume of water within Taranaki. We've got a maunga right there, right on our back's doorstep, so it doesn't give the opportunity for their volumes of water to be able to create those highways of access inland. But Waitara is one of those rivers. So the mouth of Waitara River was the place where Te Ātiawa focused its attention in development, focused its attention as
and the Crown.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I think the Crown focused on Waitara for other reasons. Perhaps when it originally focused on around New Plymouth and Ngā Motu and those areas there, they thought that that would be a really good place. But I think the tension became, particularly when the numbers rose within New Plymouth, the tension then escalated, saying there's a better place just down the road where it has a river and maybe the sandbar can be overcome with dredging and all these other things, and that should be the place, regardless of the fact that Te Ātiawa, that was their key location of occupation and cultivation, and so the focus on Waitara was one. It was a focus for raising and escalating the tension because they knew Te Ātiawa was there, but also the fact that perhaps Pākehā of those times looked over the fence and the grass was greener, that maybe Waitara should have been the place that they settled in the first place. I'm not sure about that.
I just want to come back to Hapurona because there was a key relationship there with the Wiremu, Te Rangitake, Kingi. Tell me about those two leaders. How different were they?
They were almost polar opposites. In some ways, that's the best way you can have leadership. You can have strengths in completely different areas. Te Rangitake was a leader focused in on peace. He was a diplomat. He was someone who sought to build relationships, and that's what he learnt when he was in Wellington and Waikanae. Waikanae was his area. His father encouraged him along this path. So when Rereta Whangawhanga, his father said, "Come back to Waitara, kia kaue tuku a Waitara, kia makere atu I te kapu o tō ringa," he said that purposely, because he sent his son purposely because he realised that the skills of building relationships and building an economic base was the future for Te Ātiawa. Coming back to Waitara wasn't simply about occupying land and putting a stake in the ground and saying this is where our mana whenua. It was about building a future for Te Ātiawa, and Te Rangitake was the person for that. However, when the escalation of tension started to come about, and Fitzroy was seeking to negotiate that, and Fitzroy was a man, was good in his times. He negotiated a really good compromise to the difficulties that were being faced here. And then Gore Brown comes along, and he also tried to negotiate a way through, and they were reaching that point of agreement. And then along comes Grey, kia te he kuria Grey. He was the one who came in and was not interested in a relationship. He was focused in on escalating the tension. He was the one that wanted warfare in this area. That's the way we perceive it. And so that's where Hapurona then came to the fore. Hapurona was the leader who came forward and gave confidence that Te Ātiawa could defend itself in the face of this violence that they knew was just around the corner. So Hapurona was the one who knew this pathway. He was the one who said, we don't want war. War is not, I've seen war. I've seen what war gives the people, and we do not want this for Te Ātiawa. We do not want this for Taranaki, and what starts in Waitara will very quickly escalate to the whole country. He understood that, and he knew what Grey was seeking to achieve.
Perhaps tell me about Wiremu Te Rangitake. He clearly was a diplomat and he had good relations with the government early on until Grey. What kind of leader was he? How did people perceive him?
Perhaps it's better to understand Te Rangitake in today's terms, and we tend to give great status to people who give leadership around economic development and about bringing people together, building a future, a personal vision for the future, and understanding that the foundations of our future are built on solid foundations. And he was a man of those means. He came back to Waitara at a time of extreme loss and tension. So when he came back, there were Waikato people living and cultivating in gardens in Waitara at the time. He didn't come in and say and attack them and say you shouldn't be here and all that. He allowed them to see out the planting period, to harvest their crops, and then allowed them to leave without any tension at all, even though it was Waikato that came down and slaughtered all his mother's people here at Pukerangi Ora. And so he was focused in on finding a way forward where the relationships that were damaged through all of those that huge period of warfare between tribes could be resolved, and the future would be one of prosperity for all people. And this isn't just prosperity for Te Ātiawa, this was prosperity for Pākehā as well. He could see that the level of tension of Pākehā who were arriving by the shiploads into New Plymouth, and he was saying, we don't want to attack and destroy. He could see the fact that they were under extreme hardship in the town. They didn't have. He gave kai to the people of New Plymouth, to a point in some cases where they had hardship because they gave so much to the people of New Plymouth. He was seeking to build relationships, and I think Gore Brown and I think Fitzroy understood this. Gray didn't.
He was one of the rangatira who were part of the Manuapo hui. What happened there?
Manuapo was a critical point for Taranaki. I think it was, in actual fact, it was a critical point for the whole country. It was a point where people made the decision that we have to make a stand. The way in which we are being manipulated by the Crown, and Taranaki definitely understood the fact that they were being manipulated by the land agents, and they were being manipulated by the likes of, when they knew Grey and all that were around the corner. They understood that unless they set key principles in place, before long this whole area would be overwhelmed by Pākehā. They also understood that the fact that Pākehā thought that Taranaki Māori had been swept away, and there was no one around. This was almost like terra nullius, this was empty country and open for occupation. They didn't understand the fact that Taranaki definitely was focused in on what is the future for this area. They also grossly underestimated what took place at Manuapo in the house of Taiporo Henui. They believed that this group and this meeting was simply just a meeting, and before long it would dissipate, and all of the opposition to land sales would simply evaporate. They didn't understand the level of commitment that had been made in that hui. The focus was to retain land, because the future of Taranaki, the future of all Māori, was about being economically strong, and through economically strong we would be politically strong and we would have a future in this country.
What kind of signal do you think that hui and that decision to hold on to your whenua sent to the governor?
I don't think the Crown fully appreciated or understood why Māori would even want to hold on to land. As far as they could see, is that Māori had these vast areas of land that weren't under cultivation. They thought that there was so much land here that why can't we just have it? But they failed to understand that the way we perceive land is around rohe, around domains, and about areas of authority, and the way we divide up our regions of authority is based on land. So the Crown didn't understand the rationale of the hui. They also framed the hui as the land league, and the word league was a dirty word in the government at the time. So the way they used language to deny the significance of what was taking place, I think created a blind spot for them. They thought that the war would be over and done with overnight. Taranaki would be an easy beat. 21 years later, they were still here resolving the conflict that they started in 1860.
Following that hui and the decision that was made, there were pou put into the ground. Can you talk us through that process and how significant that was for Māori?
We refer to these as pātu tūtahi. We refer to them as po put in the ground that identified areas where no more land would be sold. They recognised that Pākehā were within Taranaki, and so the areas that Fitzroy had put aside, and then Gore Brown and then Grey had taken over, they were willing to concede that as a compromise. But beyond those beyond those areas that they had put aside specifically to demarcate the area where Māori would retain ownership and retain authority, that is the area where they made that commitment to retain land, and that is the area where they were seeking to make their stand.
Having made this understanding that no more land sales would happen, generally the iwi would have understood that and abided by it?
It was well understood by the people of Taranaki wide, because they had their leaders there at Manuapou. So when the government found out about this and they denied any significance to it, they then started to work on the people who were perhaps a little bit to the side of those relationships, and they built them up into positions of significance, when in actual fact the people were very much focused around the leadership of the likes of Te Rangitaake, Te Matakate and others who had made that commitment. They stayed firm to that commitment. So when it came to the conflict within Waitara, those divisions had already been created by the Crown, and they utilised those divisions then to drive a wedge between the people. They also understood that there were certain people who had grudges against certain leaders, and so they managed to focus their attention on those grudges. And they knew that certain leaders, they weren't averse to getting the government in, allowing the government to use violence, to use the war as a means, not so much to take over their area, but to act against their enemies, the ones that they were having their grudges with.
Te Teira is one person who's written in the history books as somebody who sold land and was at the centre of this kind of grievance. But is it as simple as that? You know, I guess, isn't this a tactic that happened back then that's recorded now?
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate that Te Teira became the key focus, and sometimes you need a name to attach all this grievance to, and Te Teira became that person. When in actual fact, in any community there are these tensions, and those are the tensions that were manipulated by the Crown. There were ones such as Ihaia Kirikumara, there were other ones such as Rawiri Waiaua. There were people that were saying we need to sell land because there is so much demand for land among Pākehā, and we want to build the relationship. This is the strategy we should use. We should sell the land in this area. So they were denying the strategy that had been confirmed at Manuapou to retain land beyond certain points. That was the tension that was escalated by the Crown and Te Teira, unfortunately, for particularly I ka aloha atu ki o rātou whānau that the descendants of Te Teira are burdened by this, when in actual fact this was a focus for the Crown, and this is, we would say, kei runga ke ngā pokohiwi o te karauna ke.
What are some of the tactics, the manipulation tactics that you've heard?
The relationships were being manipulated in a way that Pākehā was saying to Māori they are close friends, and this is the way forward, and being told that if they are able to go beyond these boundaries, that we will be able to resolve this conflict. But Pākehā knew that they were saying those simply to gain access to certain people, and then to be able to use them to challenge the authority of Te Rangitaake and others. So the ways in which they were manipulated were many, and they focused on those conflicts. But I think it's important to also realise that there were Pākehā living beyond those points. And when the tension escalated into those areas, they weren't even, sometimes the battles took place right outside their houses, and they weren't attacked. So the focus wasn't
on them.
Te Rangitaake said, we don't want to escalate this violence. I think this is our quarrel. We need to deal with this ourselves. And so, I mean, there's some stories of, you know, people being out on their farms and the battle takes place around them, and they're like standing in the middle of this battle, and the aggression is not upon the Pākehā standing there, but trying to resolve this between themselves, and sometimes violence was the way in which they were resolving that.
So let's go to the Crown had identified some Māori who had land and had, you know, moved to survey and purchase that. Tell me about that surveying, because we understand that there was a resistance to that. What are some of the stories you know of?
You know, it's a little bit hard to look at the context back at that time and put it in our times. We're so used to the land court, and the identified owners are very clear in many cases. We have shareholders and all those sorts of things. If we take ourselves back into those times, the idea that Māori have had this block of land from here to there is very clear. It wasn't like that. We didn't have those clearly demarked sort of
boundaries.
Zones, those boundaries. And so when it came to people such as Te Teira, and it came to people such as Ihaia Kirikumara, they were understood as having leadership over their groups, their whānau, and they were living in certain areas, so they had authority, they had mana whenua in those areas. But the clearly defined boundaries that then the Crown wanted to impose upon those areas, that is also what created tension. So when Rawiri Waioa decided to sell this land, it was in grey area. There were other people living in those areas who didn't want to sell that land, but the Crown ignored all of that. They imposed the sale, and it created that tension that then became the escalation into war.
There's a story about a old lady, Kate, I think she is, and you know, she's just one of many. But tell me about how particularly the older woman resisted the surveying.
Well, that's part of the beauty of having a legacy of peace within the region, is that even Hapurona himself said, we want to follow a pathway of peace. So when the surveyors and the soldiers came into the region and they were pushed back, they, at every stage, I don't believe the soldiers and that were attacked. It was always the attacks came from the Crown towards Māori. So when the surveys came through, and Keita and others, they weren't interested in creating tension. They weren't interested in fighting against them with violence. They pulled those pegs as a demonstration, telling the surveyors, these pegs are inappropriate on this land. This is our land. This is our place.
The manipulation tactics that, you know, that your people had to experience. Tell us about some of those that you understand.
Well, the main one was that they sought to become very friendly with some people and then demonize others. Immediately a person said that they didn't want to sell land, they were automatically the enemy. The selling of land became the key way in which you determined whether you were friendly or whether you were a rebel. And that lasted for years within Taranaki. We never ever shook that off. And so parts of Te Ātiawa were deemed rebel for no other reason than they wanted to retain their land.
So in the case of Rangitake and say Te Teira, who already had an issue, which was a whānau issue, they would have seen a weakness there?
They definitely saw a weakness in the relationship between Te Teira and Te Rangitake. They, to a point, I believe they probably escalated that feeling within Te Teira. They probably even suggested that, you know, we're here to help you, and if you sell your land, we will ensure that you'll be protected and your people will be protected. And that was probably quite favourable from Te Teira's perspective, simply because Te Rangitake was growing in status, and his mana was extending well beyond. And so the tension that was there between Te Teira and Te Rangitake, he was feeling like his position was slipping away. And Te Teira, he had a good strategy. He had an approach that people understood. He was a true leader. And the Crown sought to deny that leadership.
Take us from the land sale with Te Teira to Te Kohia, the first shots of the Waitara War.
I think Te Teira proposed the sale of the land earlier on, and so the Crown started to investigate what that meant, and so the people within Waitara who were living in Waitara and cultivating the land became aware of the focus was now on Te Teira's land. And when they became aware of that, that's when they started to approach Paris and say, please explain. Started to approach, Gore Brown came through, Hadfield came through, all of these people, and they realised the tension was rising. And then it came to a point where Hapurona stood and performed as karakia. That was the point at which Te Ātiawa said, this sale is wrong. We want no part of it. We want no part of the consequences of the sale of this land will result in war. They made it absolutely clear, and so they knew that the Crown refused to accept that. They knew that the Crown was going to carry on, and so they built Te Kohia as a means of distracting maybe attention from the people.
Like a decoy.
Well, as a decoy, almost as saying that if they built this pa, they understood that the Crown would attack it. That would then show the people that the Crown was going to instigate this war. If the war was going to come, let it not be us.
So building Te Kohia as a decoy, or to see what would happen next. And what did happen?
Well, when the troops saw Te Kohia, they would have seen that it's built very close to the road that they were using, and they would have seen it as a threat. They would have perceived it as a place where Te Ātiawa was going to build a large stand and hold their ground. However, when they attacked it, they bombarded it overnight and they broke down a number of the palisades. Had only just been put up almost overnight, over a day or two. I'm not exactly sure how long, but they charged at the pa, and when they arrived in there, there was no one in there. There was kai in there, and in many ways, the kai I think is quite a good reference point to perhaps, I don't know whether they meant it to be there, but the fact that the kai was there was perhaps an explanation of that there was hospitality there rather than wanting to attack. But the key point is that it was attacked by the Crown, thinking that this is where Te Ātiawa was going to hold their ground and to take a stand. But when they attacked, there was no one in there. So that then meant that the Crown was the instigator of the war. From Māori perspective, that was all important. If Māori had launched the first attack, well, then we would have been in the wrong. However, the Crown had done that. That demonstrated that they were the one who were the aggressor.
And what had happened to the iwi?
As far as I understand, once the attack started on Te Kohia, the people of Waitara had already started moving. They were moving inland. They had moved up the Waitara River. They knew those places very, very well, and so they had found places of sanctuary well away from where they knew the conflict was about to occur. And Hapurona had begun to make his plans and the strategies well beforehand at Puketā Kauere, knowing that the Crown would continue on their attacks within the valley.
How did he let everyone know it had started?
Well, there were a number of mechanisms. One was that they would have known, that they would have heard all of the gunfire in the area, so they would have heard that the conflict had begun. But one of the kōrero that had been retained within Taranaki, and it's one of our waiata from Pariaka, and is about a kōrero that was sent from Waitara to Te Iringa. Te Iringa is one of the highest peaks in the ranges of Kaitake, and it said that she sent a signal, and it suggested that she lit a fire to tell the people on the other side of Kaitake that the conflict had begun in Waitara. And been suggested perhaps that they had sent a kōtiro because seen a young girl running through the forest for the soldiers. They wouldn't have thought much of that. If they had seen a warrior running through the forest, they would have immediately become a target. So sending someone like that, I think it again demonstrates the level of strategy and the deep thinking that they had around how to de-escalate the potential for conflict.
What followed in the conflict? So Te Kohia, everyone knew it was on, they retreated inland. What was next?
Then they, as far as I'm aware, they began to focus on Puketā Kauere. They could see that there was a large fortified pā there at Puketā Kauere, and Onuku Kaitara, that's slightly to the side, they didn't fully appreciate the significance of that as well. That then, within the battle, they became quickly aware that they were in a very well-formed strategy by Hapurona.
That was, again, a bit of a trick, really, and they fell for it because Hapurona did well there.
Well, I think that again demonstrates the fact that the significance of the strategy that Hapurona had with Te Kohia by focusing the aggression on Te Kohia, they had more than enough time to observe what the tactics that the Crown was going to be used, to see the size of the force that they were using, and it gave them plenty of time then to fine-tune how they were going to direct the attention of the Crown at Puketā Kauere.
There were conflicts that followed, Māhuetahi being one of them, but really Waireka was where things started to turn, really.
Well, the Waireka is again a very complex story. Waireka is a place where the Crown had moved back into Omata and had occupied those areas, and the jury farm and the others. They had been alerted to the fact by Māori that tensions were rising, and you need to start moving back because we don't want for you to be in the crossfire of the potential of conflict. And we are standing our ground at our pā. They built the pā at Kaipōpō, and they created this a level of protection. As far as I understand, they were protecting the Pākehā in that area. However, many of the Pākehā living in that area saw it more as a threat, Kaipōpō as a threat, and so there were some who were killed because they sought perhaps through bravado to attack and to create tension. As far as I know, 5 people were killed in that tension. But the vast majority of the Pākehā who were living in the area at Omata, they understood that they were under no real threat, and they had retreated, and they understood they were given guarantees that they wouldn't be attacked, and they believed that. They trusted the leadership of Taranaki in that area. So the tension in that area was not extremely high, even though some hotheads had moved into that area. As far as I know, Kaipōpō was sent more as a signal. The people that were living in around Omata, they knew that they weren't under a threat. They had been given assurances that they weren't the focus of this pā, and that the pā was a way to tell the government that they shouldn't come beyond this pā. So it was a signal to the Crown. But the Crown, whipped up with the frenzy of war that it had begun here in Waitara, then said, heck, the people of Omata are going to be attacked. They had already started to build up a large number of troops within New Plymouth, and they had already formed themselves into militia. The people who were living in New Plymouth were ready to attack. They had been gearing up. They were tired of being almost penned into New Plymouth, and so they saw this as an opportunity. Even though the people of Omata were saying we're not under a threat, they went in there to rescue these people who weren't under threat. And then when the HMS Niger, when the Navy came along with its warship, this was their moment. They didn't go to Waitara where the conflict was. They were going to come in there as the cavalry and save the people of Omata, when in actual fact they weren't under threat. When the troops from New Plymouth came through, they were perceived by the people at the Pa, this was an attack, so they came under fire. But when the HMS Niger came along with all of its firepower, with the Marines, they attacked Kaipopo and with real strength, and eventually they overtook the Pa.
From Waireka, what happened from there?
Well, the Kaipopo was never really a Pa to launch, to hold a strong position. It was always more of a signal. And so when the leadership all gathered there at Kaipopo, they were very much observing what was taking place. They were almost having a conference or having a discussion as to what was the best way forward. And so all the key leaders were based there at Kaipopo at the time. They were having discussions as to what was the best way forward. So people such as Paura Kukutai, who was a huge influence there at around Warea, where the economic base was. Te Matakate was there, Tito Te Rei Hana Taua was there. Many of the leaders were there to observe what was taking place at Omata, and they came under attack. Te Matakate, the great leader, Te Matakate, said, this is not a good place to make a stand. He said to his people, we need to have another approach, but they were already in that location, and the war quickly escalated into that area. When they were attacked by the HMS Niger, he was saying, hold your ground, do not retreat, focus your attention here, come into this area. He was giving all this direction, but the people weren't well prepared at that point. They believed that they had negotiated a good agreement with the people at Omata, and they had given the assurances that they weren't going to escalate the violence. I don't believe the people of Taranaki iwi thought that the violence and the warfare was going to be focused in their direction. They believed that it was still based in Waitara. So when Kaipopo fell, and that was huge, they were the leadership of Taranaki. Many of the leaders, Tito Te Rei Hana Taua, Paura Kukutai was killed in that battle. They retreated, the people retreated to Warea. The ship followed them. The HMS followed the people, and they didn't attack a Pa site. They decided to attack the economic base. They decided to bombard Warea for 48 hours from the sea to completely annihilate any potential for Taranaki to regroup and rebuild an economic base. And that's the point at which Tohu and Te Whiti then took leadership, because Paura Kukutai was killed, many of the leaders were killed, and the people said, we have to find another way. And Tohu and Te Whiti, who were leaders in waiting, they were being trained, they were being nurtured into these roles of leadership, were then thrown into those roles, and they gave leadership for peace rather than being engaged in the violence.
And how long after the decision to be peaceful and to lead differently did the Crown and the troops come here to Pukerangi-ora?
Well, Pukerangi-ora was really at the end of the first war. I hate using that phrase, the first Taranaki War. We definitely consider this as one continuous war for those 21 years. But at first stage, ka tiriwa I reira ana, ka tahi ka tuarua mai te pakanga. But the idea that the first war was a victory for the Crown, that's anyone's guess as to who was the victors, and that the Crown was certainly taught a lesson, but we were also taught a lesson as well. We were taught a lesson about ourselves and how we needed to approach this. We were waiting for the Crown to admit its guilt. Even though there was a truce and we signed a surrender to stop further war, we were all waiting for Grey to admit the guilt of Waitara, to say that was inappropriate. And he held off and held off and held off, and instead troops were sent to reoccupy Tataraimaka, Why on earth they decided to do that is anyone's guess. Through ignorance, through arrogance, but through the reoccupation of Tataraimaka immediately re-escalated the tension in Taranaki iwi, and that is what sparked the second stage of the war. And then after the war began, suddenly Grey, te kuria Grey nei, ka ki atu, I was going to apologise. Well, it's too late then. The war had escalated, and they already had their plans to begin the confiscation of the whole of Taranaki. 1.275 million acres confiscated as punishment for Taranaki defending its own land. Grey is really, I believe, the central point of the decision making to deny Taranaki its authority within the region. Grey is the one. Grey is the one who came in, stopped negotiating, said the way forward for Taranaki to take all this land is violence, is warfare, and with war we will overcome and push Taranaki iwi off these lands, and we will then have open slaughter. Taranaki will be ours.
When you talk about all the land that was lost by the force of the Crown, what else do you think the people of Taranaki have lost with the land?
That's a big we need to understand the sense of loss and sense of trauma, of what this does to a people. You can lose land, and land isn't lost. You lose authority over land, and you never ever forget that. You never ever forget that the fact that your tupuna were buried in those areas, and you never agreed for it to be lost to you. You never forget the fact that you were told one thing and then something else completely else was done. You never forget the fact that that the tactics the Crown used against you were completely different to what you were told to be by the missionaries, and saying that the Western civilization was a civilization of peace, and to be civilized you need to put aside warfare and conflict and follow the Bible. And immediately the next point, the Crown is using the same tactics you were told were uncivilized and primitive and barbarian. They're using those tactics again. How do you recover from that? What is the trauma that results from that? It results from 21 years of this, of sustained pressure, 21 years of being belittled, being demeaned, being denied the ability to re-establish communities and homes, to be able to raise your children in a position of peace. Pariaka itself, the central location to be a place of peace, was attacked and destroyed for no other reason than the Crown saw it as a threat to its authority. How do we comprehend that in today's times? How do we even measure that in today's times? We have to look overseas and look at what big superpowers have done to people and destroyed civilizations, to say that is beginning to maybe equate to the level of desolation and devastation that was visited upon Taranaki.
When you know all this about your history and the way that your people were treated, and then you live here with the names on the streets and the farmers owning the same piece of land that was confiscated, how do you live?
Yeah, it's really hard to look back at history. Not so much. I mean, you can look back at history and say, our tupuna went through all of these conflicts, and we're in a better space now. But when you look back at the conflict and say those were never resolved, we are still in a position of being demeaned and being belittled in our own area. It's hard to look at history in that way. So the way I think we get through this the way we look at history is to say that there is a legacy that is unfulfilled. Our tupuna constantly said the way forward was peace. And even though we never were able to achieve that peace, we were never able to achieve the future of Taranaki as us being able to stand proud within our rohe and to have economic prosperity as they so clearly articulated in Waiata and Kōrero. The way forward for us is to focus on that legacy that they spoke about, that vision that they focused in, because if we focus in on the grief and the pain, we constantly pull ourselves back into that grief. I don't think that we have to get rid of all of those place names and all those other things such as Shute Street and Paris Street and Brown and all those other places, because some ways sometimes it's easy to get to it's not so we forget, but we get distracted by our future and we leave behind that past. We need to keep that in our focus, otherwise it becomes another blind spot for us. But just as I think Waitara was supposed to be called Raleigh and Pātea was supposed to be called Carlisle, at some stage those names were put aside and we were able to recognise the true names of that area. We shouldn't forget there was supposed to be a Raleigh, and there was supposed to, that was because that is part of the history, and we shouldn't allow the Crown, we shouldn't allow our communities to forget that their tupuna were a part of this history. And the way forward is to say that the peace that was sought to be negotiated in those times is still open to us in today's times, is still available to us. We just have to recognise it. And so that means recognising that there was violence and conflict and war, and there were lessons to be learnt from that.
How important, though, is it that the descendants of the settlers and the descendants of the Browns and the Greys know this side of the story, know this story?
Yeah, well, I think for the vast majority of people in Taranaki, they don't understand that. They haven't heard these stories. It's kind of like a Harry Potter thing, where in between platforms, there's platform 9 3/4 and no one knows it's there. And once you go through that doorway, suddenly a whole nother perspective on the world then becomes available to you. We understand where we live in today's times, and we think we're dealing with our issues of today and think that we're in this position because of what we've done. But in actual fact, that what has taken place in the past has set the foundation of where we stand. And so for the majority of Pākehā within the region, of our neighbours just around the corner, no matter where we are, people who live just down the road from this far side of Pukerangiora just thinks it's maybe a scenic reserve and maybe something happened in this area and have no idea of the level of conflict that took place. Okay, there's a sap just to the back, and maybe they've heard of the fact that there was an attack from soldiers, but don't understand completely of what was the impact of that for their neighbours, for Māori, because perhaps it just doesn't interest them.
Kia ora.